Hi guys, you are looking at the goal of today's lecture and our next couple days worth of work and our last kind of notes and things to talk about in our ecology unit. So our question is, how do we show the energy transfer in ecosystems? So there's a couple ways. Today we're going to talk about food chains and food webs, but we're going to address food energy pyramids in their own lecture tomorrow. So for my first kind of bell ringer question, so you can write this in the bell ringer section, I want you to identify who eats who in this picture here. Pause the video and write down your answers. I've got a picture of a caterpillar. There's a human on there, an alligator, and a yellow belly slider. It's a turtle. So you should have hopefully paused the video and written this down by now, but here's how it goes. So the caterpillar is eaten by the turtle, which I didn't know was part of the food chain, but it is. The turtle is then eaten by the alligator, and some daring humans have alligator nuggets, so they are what we consider the top predator. But what is missing in this system? If you said something green, like plants, then you're correct. So what does the caterpillar eat? I think typically caterpillars eat milkweed, but they also eat other green leafy things as well. But yeah, so all of those animals right here that we see are actually reliant on those green plants, the producers. And we're going to look at some notes and figure out exactly why. Here's our notes. By the way, I've heard that some of you are just taking this slide right here and filling in your notes and not listening to the rest of the lecture. That is definitely not in your benefit, so you should be listening to the lecture. There's a lot of things I say that aren't written down here on these notes. Alright, so this is a food chain. It's the simplest of how we show our energy transfers. It's a series of organisms, each dependent on the next as a source of food. The very bottom of our food chain is actually not anything living at all. So that word right there on the side is interdependence. All these organisms that you saw to begin with, they're all dependent on some abiotic factors like the sun, carbon dioxide, and water. So those are all nutrients. They're things that aren't living. Remember, we call these abiotic factors. So non-living abiotic factors play a vital role in an ecosystem by supporting the needs to living factors or biotic. So like nutrients, soil, air, sun, water, they're all essential for life. We need all of them. So those are really the backbone, sort of our ecosystem, because without those, we couldn't have our next guys, which are the autotrophs. And I try to draw a little plant man there, but not sure how he looks. I think he's cute. But anyways, autotrophs are actually photosynthetic organisms. Let me move my video. So autotrophs are also what we call producers. Anything green or green pigmented with the chlorophyll in them, they take carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight from the environment and turn it into sugar and oxygen. That sugar we know is glucose. Without that glucose, nothing in our system would have any energy. So producers produce their own food using photosynthesis. Without producers, we wouldn't have any of the other organisms. So producers are super important. Remember the difference between an autotroph and what we're going to learn about in a little bit, a heterotroph, is the fact that they can make their own food. Auto thinks self-sufficient. They don't need anything else. They can make their own food. Now everything else, all the other organisms that we're going to talk about today, they need these autotrophs for to survive. And the autotrophs actually take those abiotic factors like carbon dioxide and water and sunlight to make that sugar. So without the abiotic factors, our biotic autotrophs would not be living either. Now, number one, we call this our primary consumer because it is the first one to eat the food or eat in the food chain. They eat plants only. Our example here is Gary the snail. And typically, typically the primary producer or the primary consumer in the system is going to be herbivore, which means that they only eat plants, but it could also be an omnivore as well, which we'll talk about in the next slide, which means that they eat plants or animals. These are typically hunted organisms. They do not hunt themselves. And then if you pay attention to our arrows right here, The energy is moving up the chain. And because we're going to learn about it with our energy pyramid, but only 10% of the energy is actually moving up this chain here. So the energy amount that we had at the beginning with the plants is decreasing as it goes up and eventually reaches our last consumer, which is a human. Much of the energy is lost into metabolic heat loss, or heat. So hot energy, every time we have a chemical reaction, we get heat as a byproduct, and heat is pretty, it's not, it can be used, but in our chemical reactions, typically it's not used. It's a byproduct that we don't really want. Okay, so that's our primary primary consumer, and that is a snail. So they're the first ones to eat. The second ones to eat, we call the secondary consumer. Our example here is a perch, which is a type of fish that I've got on the slide for you right there. They're the second to eat in the food chain, hence the word secondary. They eat primary consumers. Okay, you get it? Two eats one. These can be sometimes hunters, so they could be a predator. They eat meat or plants, so they could be omnivores here. Remember we talked about the difference between an herbivore to an omnivore. Herbivores eat herbs, plants. Omni means both, so they eat both plants and animals. We are, as humans, considered omnivores because we eat both plants and humans, most of us. Again, reminder, make sure you put these arrows in. So energy is decreased as it gets passed from, you'll see, system to system or organism to organism. So after our secondary consumer, which is the second one to eat in the chain, we have our tertiary consumers, which eats the secondary consumers. So this is the third organism to eat in our chain. They eat secondary consumers. In this case, we call them the walleye. Typically, these are carnivores. They will be meat eaters only. They're definitely predators. They always hunt for food energy. Our omnivores don't always have to hunt because, remember, they can eat plants too. And lastly, our very top predator is the top of the food chain. We call that sometimes the apex predator. They're fourth to eat in the chain. They eat tertiary consumers, so this is humans. Now, heterotrophs are the opposite of autotrophs. Hetero means reliant on, or diverse. But think of it as reliant on, where our autotrophs they didn't need anything. They could do it by themselves. Heterotrophs can't. So they can't produce their own food. That means they rely on other organisms for nutrient intake. AKA, they've got to eat something to be able to get the energy they need. Autotrophs don't do that. They produce their own food. And lastly, we couldn't talk about systems without talking about these guys right here. These are the decomposers. They return nutrients back into the soil. So they break down dead and decaying organic matter. We talked about these when we talked about our nitrogen cycle, how these bacteria right here are actually fixing nitrogen, which is helpful for the plants. We even talked about a symbiotic relationship between a fungus and a plant root, where the fungus is fixing the nitrogen and the plant root is actually giving the fungus some of its nutrients so that the fungus fixes that nitrogen for them. And then you've got your worm as well. So these things break down dead organic matter. They're what we consider the brown guys of our ecosystem. Good. So this is your first set of notes. That's the end of it. There's a video. I put this on the page for you to watch. And we've also got this set of notes to do today. Hopefully we'll do it all in one lecture. And I know I'm going fast through these, so remember, you're always welcome to pause. Again, it is not helpful for you at all to be taking and skipping through the video to take down your notes. Not good. Listen to what I'm saying. I got some know-how. I know what I'm talking about. All right. So we just did food chains, and they're pretty simple. They just follow one energy path, but food webs are a little bit more complicated because they represent the natural flow of energy in an ecosystem. It is essentially what eats what. It's sometimes called a consumer resource system, but basically they show the different interactions between organisms, and they're a more realistic idea of what's going on in your system because not just your snails are eating the grass. It's other things like grasshoppers and bunnies and small mice maybe. I'm not exactly sure what small mice mean. And insects like crickets and stuff. So this is definitely more accurate, but also more complicated way of showing these systems. So the very first thing that we start with, we're looking at an aquatic system here. So we start with our phytoplankton, which are microscopic plants that harness the energy of the sun. They are a producer. I've got some beautiful pictures of some phytoplankton for you under the microscope right here. These little guys don't even look like real organisms, but they are. They're phyto means small, super duper duper small. Or phyto means photosynthetic. Plankton is usually indicating that it's really, really small. But these are really, really small organisms inside of the water that are actually going to be able to do photosynthesis. So they're green. And then next, I've got some zooplankton for you. So these zooplankton eat the phytoplankton. They're tiny animals that live in the water and are eaten by many fish. They're herbivores and they're consumers. This would be what we would call primary consumer, but we're going to stop using that verbiage because that goes along with our food chain. So the zooplankton eat the phytoplankton. That's how they get their energy. Plankton in the SpongeBob is a zooplankton. Zoo means animal, plankton tiny, so tiny underwater animals. Here's a more accurate representation of what these little guys look like. Many times our zooplankton are actually larvae of fish, so pretty cool, or crustaceans as well. Next, sardines eat our zooplankton. They're small fish that are essential food for birds, marine mammals, and other fish. So these are consumers. They eat the zooplankton. They're not considered herbivores because the zooplankton are technically tiny, tiny animals. So these are carnivores, or no, they're carnivores. All right, and then two things actually eat our sardines. We're going to go to the top first. Oh, sorry. These are what you buy in a can and eat. So this is your can of sardines. So your can of sardines ate zooplankton, which ate phytoplankton. Now, a garnet is one of the birds that's actually going to eat these sardines. They're large seabirds that are known for catching fish by plunging and diving. They're carnivores, they're predators, and they're consumers. And then the other thing that eats sardines are our yellowfin tuna. So these are predators and carnivores. They're large fish that are the top consumer in their own food web, but yellowfin tuna are also eaten by other things, like you'll see in a second, a shark, but I just found out that dolphins actually also eat yellowfin tuna, which is awesome. I also have fun stories about the tuna dolphin problem, which is a marine mammal protection issue. If you ever want to talk about it, I'd love to tell you a little bit more about it, but it's pretty awesome. I just don't have time to talk about it today. Okay, and the last thing, our tuna is eaten by a shark, which is what we consider the top predator of its ocean food web. Sharks are pretty scary and nasty, but this is that's going to eat that. So if you trace the energy back through the system, the phytoplankton transferred their energy when the zooplankton ate them to the zooplankton, and when the sardines ate the zooplankton, that energy was transferred to the sardines, and then the sardines were eaten, let's go with the tuna route, by the tuna, and then the tuna was eaten by the shark, so that energy is transferring again and again. In our next video lecture, you're going to learn that a very small percentage of that energy was actually transferred from organism to organism. Much of it was used in the own organism's building of body processes and building of its own muscles and its own systems that it wasn't given to the other organism. But we'll learn about that, and that's actually why we're going to learn that there's a triangle shape to our organisms as far as like how many species are there, or like how big the populations are. You're going to have a lot more of your producers, your autotrophs, your green things, than you are of your top predators, like your apex predators, because like we learned with our video and lab on predator-prey relationships, that when you have a predator population that is too large, it's going to overtake the system and then cause chaos because it'll overprey. And that's my shark again. Lastly, I would like you to try to draw your own simple food web using the following organisms and briefly describe the rule. So this will also be on your paper, so I'm looking for this too. Draw the grass, which is your producer, a mouse, which is a consumer, a rabbit, which is a consumer, and a snake, which is a consumer. All right, have a good day, guys. I hope you enjoyed this lecture. I know I went through it kind of fast. Good thing you can pause me. Have a great day. Tomorrow we're going to touch on energy pyramids. Goodbye.